Alrighty, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. How's it going? My name's Tim, and today I'm going to be talking about a suite of delicious iOS candy. I think at the moment the hotness when it comes to tech talks is architecture and definitely machine learning, but at the same time, my favorite thing about iOS is I love the graphics system and the awesome sorts of effects you can create with it. So I'd like to talk about that today. So who am I exactly? Okay, so I'm from Perth, Western Australia. It's pretty far away, hence the accent. I am currently one of the JP product engineers for Medukari, or Mercari in English. For those who haven't heard of Mercari before, it is one of Japan's biggest startups that runs a marketplace where people can sell items they don't want anymore and give them to people who do want them and increase the value of items. So it's a very, very good place to work, really good fun, and it's a very, very challenging atmosphere. Before that, I was working at Realm in San Francisco. And Realm, if anyone hasn't heard of Realm before, Realm is a database for iOS and Android. It lets you save data locally. It's like a nicer version of core data. I definitely recommend it if you haven't tried Realm before. Before that, this is not my first time working and living in Japan. I was actually working at Pixiv 5 years ago. That was back in the Objective-C times. And that was also really, really good fun. And so I've been to Japan back and forth a few times. Thanks to my dad, God bless his soul, wherever he is today. Oh, he's over there. Hey, Dad. Thanks for coming. My dad got a job at a Japanese university 20 years ago, so the family moved to Japan. My sister and I went to a Japanese elementary school for a bit, so we can speak a little bit of Japanese. And my hobbies outside of work are karaoke and video games. I love Splatoon. There's a Splatoon event on after this. The topic is, what is the better corn chip accessory, guacamole or salsa? I'm going for Team Guacamole. Cool. So when I'm not doing code at companies, I actually have this little side project app I'm working on called iComics. And I know iComics is a very lame name these days. I know it's so lame that even Apple stopped naming things whatever, but we'll get to that later. And I built it originally for the iPad 1, so it was really hard finding an iPad 1 mock-up these days. And that's what it looked like a long time ago. It was a bit more 3D than it is now because of design changes. But the idea of the app is basically, while all the big players have their own apps they use to provide their own comic content, this is supposed to be a jack-of-all-trades comic consumption app. The idea is lots of indies out there like to publish their own comics. It's especially true in Japan. And this is an app we can just put it into your iPad or your iPhone through iTunes, then consume comics on your iOS device. And it's really, really good because the author of this particular manga is a very leading author in Japan called Ken Akamatsu. And he's actually made a mission. He's running a company, I don't know if he's still involved, a company called Manga Toshokan that is involved with trying to secure the copyrights to old manga that have gone out of print and then have actually started distributing them again on the internet. So if you can pay 1,000 yen and you can get really old Japanese comic books legitimately in PDF format, and that's perfect for this sort of app. I've been working on the app for a long time, and something that has basically happened is as I'm going through, I'm discovering these needs for features I want to add. And I've been working on the app for a while, so there's a lot of features I've been working on. But I found out recently, well not recently, a long time ago that these are things that are not just useful for me, they're also incredibly useful for other people. Because they're not explicitly tied to my business logic. They're generic enough that I'm sure if I open source them, people could use them. So basically what this talk is about is I'm going to go through some of the libraries I've created for my own projects, but I've also open sourced them. So you can all use them if you want. At the same time, each of these projects had some kind of really tricky little challenge or a trick or a problem I had to solve in the process. So I thought I'd mention one problem I actually solved for each one. So the very first one I'm going to talk about is the one I actually made this week. It's called TO Badge View, and it's a badge for table view cells. So, whoa, so groundbreaking, such innovation. Never seen this before, right? But the reason why I'm actually saying, it's a really mundane view, but the reason why I'm really excited about this is I actually employed a new technique to make this I learned about at WWDC this year, and I think this is a really cool technique, and I'd love to share it with you. Before I can begin, though, let me just give you a brief primer on what layer blending is. So let's say you have your iOS device. I like the iPod. iPod doesn't get enough love. And you have a table view. If you're in the simulator, anytime you can actually go up to debug and choose show color blended layers, and you'll get something like this. And basically what's going on is this is showing you when the GPU is doing composition of the views, anything is green means it was completely opaque, so the GPU had to do no effort in just mashing it over the top of the previous layer. But anything that's red meant that it was transparent and there was some content in there where the GPU was like, okay, now I need to go through per pixel and see which bits of the foreground layer have to stay and which bits of the background have to poke through. Now this isn't really a heavy operation. This is very, very normal on iOS. But the thing is, if you're not aware about this, you can accidentally start layering blended content in each other, and the performance overhead can add up. And back on the iPad days, that was like having if you could make all of your view content opaque, that was like a guaranteed 60 frames. But the more blended content you add, the frame rate tanked very quickly. And while I wouldn't say go out of your way to try and avoid the red things, if you can just do little things to get rid of them. For example, in this case, why they're red is because they have a clear background. So the text is being rendered transparently over the white background. But since it's a white background, if you just set the background color to white, then that blending doesn't have to happen anymore. And suddenly, without any difference to the user, your app just became more performant. So avoid red when possible. And so going back now, how should we build this badge view? I mean, when you think about it, the classic use case is you generate some kind, or you make some kind of red circular image, you get a label, and you blend the two together. You put one on top of the other. The thing is, when I try and design these views, I want to make them as dynamic as possible. The idea is, if the designer wants to change something, they want to make the font bolder, or they want to make the view bigger, how can we do that as dynamically as possible so we can change these things on the fly in code? So when you think about the ways you can produce this effect, the first one is obviously you can generate these circles in these backgrounds in Photoshop and export them as PNGs. The problem is, unless you do it right, that can be really static. Like if you want to change the shade of red, you might have to re-export it. Or if you want to make it slightly bigger, you have to re-export it. And you have, unless you're using PDFs, you have to actually generate separate versions for Retina screens. So while that's a completely normal and rational way to do it, it's kind of time-consuming. The next one is you could, in theory, just use core graphics to generate these things on the fly. You can supply core graphics with a frame, and it can send back a Bezier path, a rasterized Bezier path that gives you this effect. And that's good. That's definitely good. You can make it dynamic as you want. But the thing that kind of gets me is the first one uses internal image caching, but the second one, every time you put a badge on screen, unless you develop your own caching mechanism, you're actually duplicating the exact same bitmap in memory. And that's, it's not a big problem at the same time. If you can try and avoid memory wastage like that, it's good. So yeah, it's kind of inefficient. But one thing I've been thinking about recently is what about the corner radius API? This is something that's been around forever. It's the one where you can say view.layer.cornerRadius equals that, and suddenly the corners become rounded, and it's pretty magical. So I was wondering about that again. Now, when I was working on iComics, and again, the reason why I'm so conservative about memory is who here, apart from Mustafa, who here has actually ran apps on an iPad 1 before? It's a few, yes. So we're kind of, really spoiled today with the iPads we have today, because this thing had 256 megabytes of memory at any given time. And 100 of that was always taken up by iOS. So realistically, you had 100 megabytes of workable memory. And with a comic book app, with an image that big, let's assume this is a 2,000 by 2,000 pixel image, if you decompress that into memory, that's like 40 megabytes right there. So I've already used a quarter of my memory with one image. So coming from that experience, it's kind of made me really, really try and treasure memory, and I think that's good for the most part. But at the same time, Apple just released an iPad of 6 gigabytes, so we are so lucky now. But I'm mentioning this again because I tried corner radius back on this thing, and just one would tank the performance, unacceptably. But so I basically swore off them and just went, non-blended layers as much as I could. But I noticed something interesting with iOS 11. Suddenly, Apple just went nuts with rounded corners. Like every single new UI trend that Apple introduced had rounded corners. And maybe that was because of the iPhone 10 coming in. But even if you see these new, the redesigned App Store and the redesign and the TV app, every single component there is dynamically rounded. So I was like, why did suddenly it become okay to just absolutely abuse the hell out of this API? So I actually went to WWDC this year, and I actually did a report about that here a few months ago. And I got to go to the labs, and Apple was running a lab on core animation, the technology that is used to produce the UI on iOS. And I went and talked to the guy and basically went, hey, I noticed iOS 11 went kind of nuts with corner radius. Is it okay to use it now? And he basically told me this. He said, back in those days, they were using OpenGL. And OpenGL had this really heavy sort of context swap whenever you try to produce this effect. But in Metal, when they did the swap to Metal, they actually managed to optimize Metal in such a way that the context swap was removed. And so now the effect is practically free on Metal devices, which is awesome. And he also said that in addition to that, because Apple likes that API a lot, they actually went further and actually made it so that the masking is done entirely in the GPU. So it's kind of like a bit-blit operation that does the clipping. And he said that as a result, if you know what you're doing, you can even clip things and keep them green. And I was like, whoa, that is something curious. I got to look into that. So I went back. And I was like, first thing it is, obviously, you make a sample app to test this out. So I got the most devilishly handsome iOS engineer out there, good old Air Force One. And this is one of the photos of him from WWDC. And I tried out the corner radius API. So that's just a UI image view. And if you just put the clipping on the UI image view, you can see straight away it becomes red. And that's kind of fair. Like everyone's expecting that. And I found out why it's becoming red is because when you say masks to bounds, that's what actually causes it to become red. But I did some playing, and I was trying to figure out, well, if you don't have content set to a view and set corner radius, it doesn't appear. So what if you put it in a container view, and then you make the container view mask, and then you don't actually touch the image view, you just have the container view create the clipping, suddenly you get the rounding effect, but it's also green, so it's not doing a blending pass. So let's go back to that badge view. So let's take a UI label, just set the background color of the UI label to red, and just have the text. Let's have a parent view, a container view, that has the clipping set up on it. And the result is this badge effect. And if you put that into the app, suddenly you get badges that don't have layer blending. So that's like super performant, really efficient memory use. And yeah, not really new UI, but I thought that was kind of nifty. So yeah. Anyway, so that was the main thing. This is like the hottest thing I found out this year. This is the thing I'm really excited about because I'm looking forward to just abusing the hell out of this everywhere now in all my apps. But anyway, so that was my first library. Let's have a look at some other libraries I've been working on. So this is one I made at the end of 2016, and I think some other people have done a similar UI before. It's called the scroll bar, and basically I removed the normal scroll indicator on iOS and replaced it with one you can actually control yourself. And it actually was a lot harder than I realized because iOS 11 has the new flexible height navigation bar. But basically this means for the reason I made this is because I had lots of people coming into me from iComics saying like, hey, I have collections of 200 comics. It's a real pain in the ass to swipe them all the time. Could you have like a manual scroll bar? And I was like, yeah, it should be doable. And yeah, it is doable. It is quite tricky though because that's a component of the scroll view. So what's actually happening here is it looks like the scroll bar isn't moving, but every time the frame updates, it's actually moving with the scrolling content. So it's actually moving up and down usable space. But because it's doing the same math every time, it looks like it's staying in one place. But whenever you do this kinds of things, where you're piggybacking off another view, there's a few challenges that come up. The first one is obviously how do you capture the scroll progress? You can use the delegate, but as you saw, that was a table view. I couldn't hijack the delegate because that's being used to actually populate the table view content. And you could do something hacky like get the delegate to forward that to the scroll bar. But the idea is I want to try and make this as automatic as possible. The idea is you should just be able to add this view to add the scroll bar to the view and then forget about it forever. And the great thing is this is an API that kind of has been around forever, but some people don't really use it because it was kind of messy, but there's KVO. The idea that you can actually just set an object to say like, I want to observe this property of another object. And whenever that property changes, I get an alert saying it updated. And something that it's kind of new and still kind of new and people don't really know is that in Swift 4, the KVO API actually got really, really good. So before you actually had to like say, set this object to observe, and then that object would have to implement a method in the Objective-C runtime. It was a really dirty looking method, it was hard to remember. But now in Swift 4, you can actually set a closure. So you actually say scroll view.observe, the property you want to observe, which is content offset in this case. And then you can then say, like, update the scroll bar to respond to that scrolling event. And that's so cool. I love that. I think this has given new life to KVO. Yeah. Okay, so the next one I've worked on is, this was kind of, I actually did this one for Realm, not for iComics, but it was a really interesting project. This is kind of like just to satisfy my own curiosity. So I don't know if you've seen this before. This is the settings app from iOS. Yeah, I think someone's seen this before. And so when Apple brought out iOS, when was the design change? iOS 7, they made this new trend where it was like grouped table view cells are no longer centered with a horizontal margin. They're now edge to edge. And I was like, oh, I wonder what the settings app's going to look like. But the thing is, the setting app keeps that old school style that was in iOS 6 and below, where it's a grouped table view, but they're not actually edge to edge. Obviously, because two edge to edge next to each other would look really awful. And this is just the kind of thing I've just been accepting it all these years, being like, yeah, I'm sure if I needed to write that, I could. But it actually turns out that's completely not public. Like, that is a completely custom table view that Apple has made themselves, and it's completely not available to third-party developers. And I was working on a login screen at Realm, and I was just like, I just need to have like a little element in the middle, kind of just modify a table view, and I found out it's actually really, really hard. So I decided to sit down one week and go like, all right, if I was going to modify a table view into that style, is it actually possible without just completely breaking, private APIs and the likes? And it turns out it is. So this took about a weekend to do, but I actually completely recreated that rounded effect, that rounded table view that Apple actually uses in the settings app. And as you can see, if you tap them, it actually changes color with the rounded corners intact, and the separator goes away, so you still get the behavior of a table view, but it has this new style. And I went kind of nuts with the layer blending, so I actually made it so only the corners themselves perform the layer blending pass. The idea is hopefully it's super performant. And so the section headers there, they're system created and they're transparent. But if you wanted to extend it further, you could override them and make them also opaque, and you get like really, really high performant zero layer blending. So how would you do that? Stack Overflow, like you can go on Stack Overflow. This is not a new question. Everyone on Stack Overflow has asked this before, and everyone's like, oh, it's easy. Then you realize it's not easy. So there's like a couple major steps. The first thing is basically you have to subclass every UI view involved, and then override layout subviews, because every tick it tries to reset back to edge. So you need to call layout subviews every single frame to force it inwards. And then you have to remove the separators from the top and the bottom, so they have that nice lineless sort of border. And then again, we have another table view subclass for the top ones and the bottoms to manage those rounded corners. And then, a UI table view fights back the entire time. Like, you can't just set something once and hope that it doesn't change, because the next tick of the UI table view will reset the entire state back to the way it was. So basically, it feels like it's not very performant, because it's basically Apple does their change, and then you put the change back on every tick of the frame. And that's not the only thing. So this is like magic in UI table view, that what happens is when you select, and this happened with my badge view I found out, when you select a cell, it like goes through every single view as a child and sets the background color to match. So like with my badge view, I found out if you click it, the background goes away. I was like, well, that's kind of not cool. That's not a very nice effect. But this is actually a very solved problem, because this has been around since iPhone OS 2. In this case, in the badge view case, what I did was I actually just made a UI label subclass and then just made it so only I control when the background color is set. But on this one, what I actually ended up doing, this is a cool app, by the way. This is called Reveal. This lets you introspect UI iOS apps. The Reveal folks were here a few years back. And Reveal recently added the ability to show CA layers. So these are the components of UI views that actually render content to the screen. So if you break out of the UI view layer and drop down to the CA layer, English, you can actually see that you can actually still create content, but then all the magic of UI table view can't get to it. So it stayed the way I wanted it, and then I actually manually updated the transition to gray when you actually tap it. Yeah. So CA layers. I did a talk about CA layers at TriSwift a few years ago in Japanese, but there's also an English version floating around. So if you want to learn more about CA layers, definitely go check out the TriSwift videos. This is one I made recently. This is one I've been working on at Tokyo iOS, sitting in that chair. So this is good. This is me giving back, me not listening to other talks. This is called TR navigation bar. This is an effect it got kind of prevalent in later versions of iOS. Things like the App Store and the TV app, they have this new effect where like you transition to a view and the navigation bar turns clear. And then you can pull it down and the banner changes shape. Then you scroll up and it just turns back into a normal UI navigation bar. You scroll back down, it comes back to the sweet banner art. You scroll up again, and it kind of just automatically, completely tied to the scrolling transition. And again, I was like, that looks like a really simple thing to do. I'm sure Apple has a public API for that, but no, they've been keeping this sweet effect to themselves. So I basically rolled that. It's actually really easy once you know how to do it, because basically what that entailed was to remove the normal translucency views and the borders and the title, and then roll back your own custom ones and then explicitly control those yourself. So it was kind of like gut the native one and then fill it with custom content. But the biggest challenge, I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out, is if you go back, you saw that you could actually control it with your thumb. When you swiped back, it would actually play back the animation in time with your thumb. And that's kind of really tricky, because how do you actually hook into that pre-canned animation? And so I spent a lot of time Googling this, and I found out that this is a lovely guy. I met him once at a meetup in America. His name's Tyler Fox. He now works at the UI Kit team at Apple. He actually talked about how to do this in iOS 11. Back in the old days, it actually was a bunch of CA, core animation hacking. But now, in iOS 11, they've actually brought out a proper native API called a transition coordinator, which is a component of UI View Controller. And so the code actually just looks like this. You can basically say, in view will appear. You can check if your view controller at that time has a valid transition coordinator object. So just check if let coordinator equals self.transition coordinator. If it does, that exposes an API that you can provide your animations as a closure, and then that hooks in with the transition animation, and that also gets the ability you can control the animation manually. So I really love that effect, and I'm really happy I was able to do it, because before this I had literally no idea how to hook animations like that. Another thing I built. So this is one I built. I built this one mainly out of kind of like a personal interest, but I plan to use this one in iComics a fair bit. It's called Status Bar Simulator, and we can probably tell what it is it actually just yanks out the real status bar and puts in a UI image view at the top that looks like the status bar, and it actually hooks the status bar system. So when the real status bar would turn white, this one also turns white, but it doesn't change. It just looks like that. And the reason I did that is a variety of reasons, but the main one I wanted is when you do things like marketing screenshots for your app, Apple have a very standard rule. They always say it always has to be 941, you always have to have full reception, full Wi-Fi, and full battery. And short of Photoshop, there's not really an easy way to get that on a device. Like even if you do the screen recording, the status bar changes, but the battery icon doesn't turn black. It's always green, which I actually filed a radar, and they were like, yes, this is a duplicate. So I was like, okay, so I could make this a CocoaPod and just make it that whenever I'm running my scheme that I use to generate the screenshots I use for the App Store, this can just automatically slide itself in. So while I'm generating screenshots, I get the proper full-on marketing sort of status bar style. But another reason I actually thought this was really good is back at Realm, we would actually run demo apps, and we'd leave them out on a table. People could just pick up an iPad, like an iPad or iPhone. People could pick it up and look at it. And obviously, the status bar would look really ugly because it'd be, AT&T in the top and like half battery and a quarter Wi-Fi. So for like things where you're like demonstrating your app, like kiosk mode, it's like putting your app in a kiosk, you can have this, so you can't actually see the real state of your iOS device. You can keep it private, and this makes it look a lot more clean and professional. But how does this work? How do you actually find the status bar so you can yank it out and put a fake one in its place? So if you people might not really know about it, but UI window is the main API that silos content for a specific app. And you don't really touch UI window except for when you're setting up your app. But UI window is great because you can segregate content that needs to be segregated. So for example, the most normal use case is you have your app UI window, but then when an alert dialog pops up, that'll put itself in a separate window. So none of your app content can accidentally bleed over it. So the status bar itself is actually another window on top of that, a very special status bar window. And that just lives above your app. And you can actually get to it with this incredibly private API, which is just cool, your application.shared.va 4-key status bar window. And if you try and ship an app with that, then Apple will catch you and reject you. So this is purely just for your own development means. And then once you get the window, you can then just iterate through the subviews and find them. And so in case you're wondering, there's actually two now. We have the original status bar from all the old devices. And then the iPhone 10, and I'm guessing the new iPad Pros, their status bar is actually called UI status bar _modern in the code. So you know it's new. But yeah, so now basically I just have my little thing just grabs the window and then loops through, and if it finds status bar modern or status bar not modern, it just grabs that, hides it, and sticks in my UI image view. All right, 2 more to go. This one I spent like 3 months building in 2017. Like this is something I've been wanting to add to iComics for a long time. I still haven't added it to iComics, but the idea is a lot of people that come to me and say like, we have a family iPad, and I read really violent comics or something like that, and I want to have like a passcode lock so my kid can't just pick up my iPad and look at my extremely not safe for kids comics. So hopefully you've seen this effect before. I basically made you can actually present a passcode over your app, and then the app won't work until you put in a passcode. And it looks kind of similar to some other passcode. We'll get into that later. And the idea is basically you can configure this. Yep. And if you put in the right code, it'll dismiss. And I actually made a settings panel as well, so that's a custom keyboard as well. So you can go in and actually change the keyboard. And I also set up several different modes. You've got digits here, but there's also, you can do alphanumerical, 6 digits. I think I went to 6 digits here. And I don't show it in this video, but I also went one above Apple and made it so it also works rotated. So it looks kind of funky, but you can actually have like a horizontal keypad on an iPhone. It doesn't look too terrible. There you go. Yeah, and so basically it looks like that. And this has actually just scratched one of my own curiosity itches, because I was always wondering, how do you get that sweet button press effect, where like it's a translucent effect, but when you tap on it, the whole button turns translucent. It turns out it's actually really easy. Really easy. So this is, again, a breakdown and reveal. So if you've never used the vibrancy APIs before, there's a view called UI Visual Effect View, and you can set different modes on it. And the mode here is vibrancy effect. And basically what that means is any view you put in the effect view, it doesn't matter what color it is, it just takes the alpha channel and then applies that, and then applies the vibrancy effect. So how to actually get that button pressing effect is I have in the vibrancy view two circular images. One is a hollow circle, and the other one is a completely full circle. And the completely full circle is slightly smaller, so it doesn't overlap the anti-aliasing edges of the bigger one. And so when you tap on it, all that happens is the bright white circle becomes visible, and then when you let go, it animates its alpha value back to 0. So it's actually just animating a white circle, but thankfully the vibrancy magic of iOS 7 and up create this really nice, appealing sort of like vibrancy effect. That also came in with a problem though. The problem is you can't, once a view is in this vibrancy view, you can't animate its alpha. If you try, for example, let's just take the vibrancy view, and the two circles are children of this view. If you try and animate it, as you can see, like it'll be gray until the animation finishes, then it'll become translucent, and that looks kind of awful. But it was kind of like, well, that's just like an inherent like limitation of the platform. What do I do? But then I realized, well, I was already getting the alpha effect by fading in the subviews. So what we have to do is, instead of animating the vibrancy view, just leave that thing completely visible, but change the alpha values of the components inside it. So it's literally just like get the child views, and then set the alpha to 0, and then set the alpha to 1. And as you can see, now we get a gradual gradient, fade in, and the buttons are vibrant the entire time. Yay. There's just one more thing. I'm sure you probably would have guessed it already. But because that looked very much like the passcode view from iOS, Apple really freaking hate it. So people have already tried to submit apps with it, and Apple like got them up on the phone and was like, "You can't put this in your app. What is this, a security risk?" And I was like, "Oh, okay. I thought I could get away with this, but no." So like, apparently I need to redesign it just so it looks different somehow. The problem is Apple won't say how different it needs to be. They just said make it different. So I'm open to suggestions if anyone's like a really pro designer who can design things for no good reason. Anyway, that's Apple. I mean, it makes sense. Like, it's security. All right. And this is my main one. This is the one it's number 1 on my GitHub because it's pretty popular. It's called my crop view controller. So whenever I demo this view controller, my model is the family dog. Her name's Nikki. She's 17, but she's still very genki at the moment. She's going strong. And basically, what the crop view controller is, let's say you need to crop a photograph, or it's rotated the wrong way. The idea is you can take a photograph and you can just like drag around the region of the photo you want. And as you can see, it has this really nice effect where the outside is translucent and the inside is not translucent. So you can actually get a really good contrast of what your final crop will look like. And you can also do things like set the aspect ratio. Like sometimes it might need to be a square for reasons, or 16 by 9. And basically, it has a timer. So as you interact with it, you can drag it any way you want. But then after a timer, it like resets itself back to the middle. Have a look. And so it's a very simple effect. This is not a new thing. Like I actually found a lot of other crop controllers on the internet. In fact, one of my coworkers from Realm, Katsumi Kishikawa, also wrote one. So I actually had to chat with him about how the techniques for it. The question is though, like, how do you go about doing something like this? Like, here's another picture of the dog looking all smoky on my balcony. If you step back and think about how the layer composition should go, we basically have a single image, part of it's obscured, and another part of it's not obscured. So logically what you would do is you'd have the image in a scroll view, and you'd have these elements that obscure it kind of like in the foreground, and like you've cut a hole in them somehow. And in this case, if you wanted to cut a hole this way, you'd have to have 4 copies of the same content, because you'd have to have the top bit, the bottom bit, the left and the right. So you have these 4 squares that create this hole in the middle where you can see the content poking through. So yeah, it's like, do you have to cut a hole? That means I have to manage 4 different views to get this effect. The problem.
Just want to observe that it is after 1 o'clock.
Oh dear. Yep. Yeah. Oh sorry, it's 30 minutes already. Okay, I'm very close to the end. I'll speed it up. Okay, so but the problem is, it's actually more complicated than that, because we have a base scroll view, we have another view that actually dims it, you have another view on top of that actually makes it blurry, but here's what we can do. We can take a copy of the same image, clip it, and then have the cropping box, and then just put the clipped image over the content, and create the illusion that there's a hole, but it's actually just 2 copies of the same image. And then when you actually swipe it, you use the scroll view delegate to update the positioning of both of the views to appear like they're in sync. And what we get is we get this illusion that there's a hole, but there actually isn't a hole. And so it looks like that in reveal. But that's a great thing, because now suddenly does it have to be a rectangle? Because it's not a hole, it's actually just an illusion of a hole. So there's nothing stopping you from using a circle. And so suddenly you can have like this iOS profile effect. You actually are creating the bounds for a circle as opposed to a square. And that's what it looks like in reveal. Anyway, that's all of it. The code is all open source. It's all MIT. Go nuts with it. My GitHub is github.com/TimOliver. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic weekend. Sorry for going over.
No problem. I'll permit anyone who's dying to ask him a question to ask him a question.
No news is good news, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Inami.
No problem.
The library is very similar to Apple's utility, right?
Yes?
Passcode is now rejected, you said?
Yes, so the passcode one just will not be accepted by Apple.
Other libraries.
Sorry?
It also looks the same in other libraries.
But the other ones don't actually. Oops. Yep, I got that. Yep, that's okay. Yep, that's okay. The other ones don't actually are not security risks though. Like Apple is actually very touchy about just the passcode controller. So the other ones look similar, but Apple haven't got a problem with them.
You should put Pokemon on it. I'm sure no chance of rejection then.
Yeah, about that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, everyone.